The battle for control of the world's oceans extended into all the great wars of the 20th century, both cold and hot. Superpower became one word instead of two, as dominance passed from one small island on the Atlantic coast of Europe to a continental colossus 3,000 miles away, which also spoke English. But human scientific ingenuity was about to add another dimension, which would make control of the sea dependent on control of space. For most of the 19th century, sea power, backed by industrial preeminence, gave Britain superpower status in all but name. Prior to World War II, the world, with only minor exceptions, acquiesced in Britain's control, looking to her to uphold an ever-growing codification of the laws of the sea, which placed a restraint on British power except in time of war. During World War II, the American Navy replaced the Royal Navy as the foremost maritime force in the world. By the end of 1945, the U.S. Navy comprised 65,000 ships, manned by more than 4 million men. But its superb performance was obscured at war's end by technological marvels that had played little part in the war, until one day, at Hiroshima, they ended it.
Amphibious sea power had marched across the Pacific and was about to land in November 1945 on the main islands of Japan. So it was a great success story. But ironically, that war against Japan is ended by atomic bombs dropped from the air. And the war in Europe in its last few months has been attended by the firing of V2 ballistic missiles from Germany onto London. In other words, the war which sees sea power triumphant closes with new technologies which put a question mark over the usefulness of sea power in the future.
In military terms, the V2 and the atomic bomb had been a complete success, pointing the way to the future and creating a need for new strategic thinking. Some believed that sea power had lost its preeminence, and that continental powers such as the US and the Soviet Union had initiated a new kind of long-range conflict in which the sea would play little part. Some military analysts had been predicting such a development since railways made land transport swifter and almost as cheap as transport by ship. The chief exponent of these heretical ideas was an English geographer, Alfred Mackinder.
Stalin, in many respects, fulfilled Mackinder's prophecy. Mackinder had said that who controlled the heartland of Eurasia would control the world island. The world island was all of Europe and all of Asia together, and whoever controlled the world island would control the world.
Stalin had maintained an army of 175 divisions, 25,000 frontline tanks, and 19,000 aircraft. By 1947-48, the formidable MiG jet fighter was in service, and a long-range strategic air force was being created, as well as a modern navy. But the Russians, like the Americans, saw a future in which unmanned long-range weapons would supersede conventional forces of all kinds.
It's not surprising that both the Soviets on the one hand and the West on the other scrambled to get their hands on those German scientists and take them back to their own countries to develop weapon systems. These weapon systems would be unmanned, they would be long range, they would be incredibly fast, they would cover perhaps thousands of miles in a very brief time, and they threatened every form of traditional power. They threatened the viability and usefulness of traditional armies. They seemed to make traditional navies irrelevant. To the alarm of the Air Force, they made increasingly manned fighters and bombers irrelevant.
In 1949, the Soviet Union exploded its first atomic bomb. American and NATO aircraft carriers, operating off the Russian coast within easy range of hostile Soviet aircraft armed with nuclear bombs, were now too vulnerable to risk, especially when a growing fleet of long-range Air Force bombers could do the job more cheaply and efficiently. The Americans, as well as the Russians, were using captured German missile scientists from the German rocket program to work for them. Both countries produced missiles capable of leaving the Earth's atmosphere and returning at devastating speeds with pinpoint accuracy. Because of rocket science, the reign of the long-range bomber was to be very short-lived. It was the devastating nature of these new weapons, combined with the destructiveness of the atom and hydrogen bombs, that limited the effectiveness of American sea power in 3 military confrontations that would follow. None of these conflicts between the communist world and the West involved directly the Soviet Union or nuclear weapons. The first was an invasion by communist North Korea in 1950, which swept the South Koreans and Americans, fighting under the flag of the United Nations, into a narrow pocket around the southern port city of Pusan. They were rescued from this dangerous and embarrassing predicament by the U.S. Navy, which still had enough landing craft and enough experienced officers and men from World War II to carry through a classic landing behind enemy lines at the port of Incheon. Though the landing had taken place without naval opposition, its success seemed to argue for the continued maintenance of a strong conventional navy. A program of carrier replacement was begun. The first of the new supercarriers, the Forrestal, was launched in 1954. It had many innovations, including an angled flight deck, which allowed the launching and recovering of aircraft simultaneously. More significant was the development of the nuclear propulsion units for ships and submarines. Admiral Hyman G. Rickover, a giant of the post-war U.S. Navy, developed the atomic technology without accident in a period of little more than 5 years.
This is the reactor, or the atomic pile. There's uranium in here, and when the uranium heats up water, which flows through this boiler and goes back again. It keeps on flowing round and round in this circuit by means of this pump. There's other water on the other side of this heat exchanger. This water is heated up and is made into steam. This flows around this way.
For a country whose navy had played little role in World War II, the Russians proved to be surprisingly adept.
For all its problems, the Russian Navy, or the Soviet Navy, Moved fairly quickly into launching missiles from sea and missiles from submarines. And equally quickly, once the Americans had perfected the whole business of the nuclear-propelled submarine into nuclear-propelled submarines. And so that kind of race and counter-race in the Cold War reflected some real strengths and some real innovations in the Soviet system, particularly in the early days of the Cold War.
The nuclear propulsion technology required no oxygen and thus did not exhaust the air of submarines, which was the major limitation of all conventionally powered submarines. Nuclear submarines became the first true submersibles, their ability to cruise underwater limited only by food supplies, toilet paper, and crew patience. In 1960, the U.S. sub Triton circumnavigated the globe underwater, following Magellan's route, a distance of more than 41,500 miles. The strategic balance of terror was no longer maintained by the manned bomber. It had been replaced as the ultimate deterrent weapon by intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, against which, for the moment, there was no defense. The missiles, fired from bases in either the Soviet Union or the United States, were detectable once they were on their way, which meant that a counterstrike could be launched before they arrived on target. The intermediate-range missiles located closer to the target were more of a threat since they were in the air for a shorter period of time. The U.S. deployed its intermediate missiles in Europe and Turkey, while the U.S. mainland, except for submarine attack, remained out of range of similar missiles possessed by the Soviet Union. The Soviets moved to counter this advantage by placing missiles in Cuba. U.S. President John F. Kennedy, seeking a measured response, ordered a naval quarantine of Cuba. The word quarantine was carefully chosen, since blockade would have been regarded as an act of war under international law. Soviet ships already underway turned back. The crisis was resolved after a U.S. guarantee that it would not invade Cuba and would reduce its missiles in Turkey.
Probably the most decisive use of sea power in the post-Cold War world would have to be the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it demonstrates in many ways the kind of, if you like, the kind of soft but mailed power of sea power. No one died. The world didn't go nuclear, got close. The crisis was resolved, but sea power provided that kind of really strong leverage to put a choke on Cuba and a choke on the Soviet Union in a way which forced the crisis to a resolution short of a shooting war. Sea power has that unique ability, if you like, to try to at least attempt to enforce compliance in a way which is indirect and pointed largely at your pocketbook and at your prestige, short of actually dropping bombs on somebody or missiles or putting the Marines ashore. So you can take this military action, whether it's against Cuba or laterally against Iraq or against Yugoslavia. You can establish a blockade. It's a show of resolve. In the case of Cuba as an island state, it's uniquely effective.
The third and last major confrontation between the two contending superpowers took place in Vietnam, though once again surrogate states were involved, the Communist North opposing the U.S.-supported South. But the fear of starting a nuclear war restrained the U.S. from using its naval power against the sponsors of Vietnam, the USSR and China. 7.4 million tons of bombs were dropped from both carriers and land-based planes, more explosives than in all of America's previous wars. The vast advantage of the U.S. in money, resources, and technological capacity proved insufficient for victory. Naval power could not prevent stalemate in Korea, a standoff in Cuba, or a defeat in Vietnam. It appeared as though the threat of atomic war had neutralized the normal exercise of the overwhelming naval superiority the U.S. possessed. The restraints on naval power were about to be lessened by another fundamental change caused by technology. The commons of the sea was gradually being linked to the commons of space, which in combination would possess decisive military advantage. The air in which air forces contended for supremacy had never been common, since every nation owned the air above its own landmass. Penetration of another nation's airspace was as much an act of war as crossing a frontier. But above the air was space, unowned and unownable, like the sea.
One of the most interesting things, which scholars have not discussed much, was the recognition at the time of Sputnik, and I think not before then, that if a satellite was launched or any other electronic or other system was put into space and it went around the globe, a country could not claim sovereignty over something which was going through its airspace up there in the way that it could claim sovereignty if a U-2 spy plane came in at a lower level.
More importantly, space would become a platform from which it was possible to see everything. Such oversight would be decisive in battle only if it was combined with sea power. With the Russian launch of Sputnik in 1957, the United States found itself in the position of Spain facing England's challenge after the defeat of the Armada. A dominance taken for granted was now in doubt. The race was on. The terminology that had named the struggle between the West and East a Cold War prevented it from being rechristened what it should have been called after 1957, the Space War. It began with a race to the moon.
It was driven in a particular historic way by the fear that the other side would do it first, and that it would gain not just this technology breakthrough of getting someone on the moon or to Mars or putting people in a spaceship which would go round and round the Earth, but that would give them a military advantage which couldn't be matched. Hence the large-scale investments into scientists and personnel and experimentation on both sides to get into space. Hence the way in which when a US administration and the Pentagon would go to Congress, they would not ask for pure research for just getting to the moon. It would be something about national pride and also national security.
The military significance of satellites in orbit was that they or their instruments would ultimately be able to see everything. Satellites were also capable of controlling and guiding missiles to appropriate targets, as well as providing guidance systems for weapons of all kinds. They could warn of impending attack and of preparations preparatory to any assault. The enemy could run, but he could no longer hide. But space, for all its usefulness, had no attack capability. Increasingly, the battle arm of space became the Navy.
The carrier battle group is still a principal instrument of United States foreign policy, the diplomatic fingertips, if you like, of how the US does its business worldwide. And the existence of ballistic missile-firing submarines beneath the surface of the sea provide what we call in nuclear deterrence theory assured second strike capability. In other words, the existence of these weapon systems deep in the oceans of the world creates the expectation in the mind of an attacker that he can't launch a preemptive strike and win. So, I mean, I think in those two very important dimensions, nuclear weapons underpin modern concepts of sea power.
In particular, those perceptions were shaped by nuclear-powered submarines. In 1986, the US had more than half its missiles in submarines, twice the number possessed by the Air Force. The Soviet Union had 1/3 of its missiles and submarines. The great advantage of the nuclear submarine is that from space, it is the least detectable weapon.
Through the Cold War, we saw submarines as the most survivable leg of the strategic deterrent triad, as well as our attack submarines able to go out and employ the attributes that are the backbone of our force today: stealth, endurance, agility, and firepower. And I think that these four characteristics, or four competencies that our submarines bring to the warfight, are the thing that will sustain the role of the submarine well into the future of warfare.
In the spring of 1982, Argentina had seized the Falkland Islands, 8,000 miles from the United Kingdom, one of Britain's last remaining colonies. In actual war, the importance of control of space to command at sea was confirmed. A hastily improvised carrier battle group set forth to recapture the Falkland Islands as the southern hemisphere moved toward winter. The official estimate of the situation by the U.S. Navy was that it was impossible for the British to recapture the Falklands against Argentina's modern air force operating close to home. But the U.S. permitted the British to have access to their secret satellite electronic signals, which enabled them to monitor at great distances the movements of the Argentine fleet, based on an old American cruiser renamed the General Belgrano.
The sinking of the General Belgrano on the 2nd of May by the British nuclear submarine Conqueror is a absolutely key element in the business of sea control and sea denial, because after that date, the Argentine surface fleet take really no further part in the operation. They effectively cede power to their air force and their naval air force in terms of the prosecution of the war.
The Argentine fleet withdrew their only carrier to the shallow waters off the coast, where British nuclear subs could not operate, effectively ending the role of the Argentine Navy in the battle. Britain's last conventional aircraft carrier, the Ark Royal, had been scrapped in 1978. The Royal Navy had designed a new class of small anti-submarine carriers designed specifically for a vertical takeoff fighter, the Harrier. Two carriers, the Hermes and the Invincible, with their ski-jump bows for launching the Harrier, formed the core of the task force. 20 Harriers were found to make the trip, but Britain was so short of pilots that 2 trainees completed their Harrier qualifications while en route. Since the Royal Navy arsenal included nuclear hunter-killer submarines, Britain was fully capable of enforcing a total exclusion zone for 200 miles around the Falklands. In effect, a blockade.
Well, the submarine element in the Falklands is an interesting one, because almost the first vessels to react to the crisis are the nuclear-powered hunter-killer submarines, which are sent south at a very early stage to effectively place a cordon sanitaire around the islands so that surface operations can take place.
There followed several days of carrier air operations in a bid to control the airspace over the island. Unlike American carrier operations in Korea and Vietnam, the Falklands amphibious landings were carried out within flying range of an elite enemy air force. But the Harrier jets were armed with the latest version of the Sidewinder heat-seeking missile, which the Argentine Air Force could not match. After losing 3 fighters in their first attack, they avoided fighter-to-fighter combat with the Harriers. British landings on the main islands, when they came, were successful and virtually unopposed. because British Seapower had made the Argentine garrison virtually captive. Space had played a role in determining the outcome of the Falkland War, but in Desert Storm, the war against Iraq, it was central to the Allies' plan of attack. Control of space not only ensured victory, but through satellite allowed people in their homes, in the White House, and in Baghdad to watch the war as it progressed. Because of space, it was possible for the first time to isolate an invading army from its home base, to cut it off without benefit of a land attack, or for that matter, mass bombing. The term surgical strike was invented to describe what then occurred. The 400,000 Iraqi troops in Kuwait, the reason for the war, ranked 12th in a list of priority targets drawn up by General Colin Powell, U.S. Chief of Staff, who was in ultimate charge of the operation. From space, Iraq's military support structures to be surgically removed were identified as follows. The Command, Control, and Communications System, their air defense systems and radar, their airfields, 30 Scud missile launching sites, the Iraqi nuclear reactor and production and storage facilities for chemical and biological weapons, 8 Imperial Guard divisions held in reserve in Iraq, storage depots, ammunition dumps, roads, bridges, 12 petrochemical facilities, the electrical system and other industrial war facilities. Only when all these had been destroyed was it the turn of Iraqi troops in Kuwait. Not only had space provided the overview, it had provided the means to guide the Allies' missiles with startling accuracy to their targets. Mixed with the high tech was a military tactic as ancient as the Vikings, the use of naval power as a decoy. American Marines in the Gulf were seen preparing to make an amphibious assault on Kuwait from the Persian Gulf. It distracted attention from the desert, where the final attack came. Had Iraqi planes attacked the carrier group, they would have discovered that the defense of the carriers was in the hands of a computer-controlled radar complex called Aegis. In Greek mythology, the battle shield of Athena, the goddess of war and peace. Aegis is capable of tracking 100 incoming threats simultaneously and can be linked to the computer and missile launch systems of other ships in the battle group to handle entirely automatic directions of dozens of anti-aircraft and anti-missile missiles toward different targets. This flagship, the USS Mount Whitney, because of its all-important role in coordinating fleet operations, and consequently its attractiveness to any enemy, is affectionately known throughout the Navy as USS Target.
Mount Whitney is the flagship for a 3-star admiral who's the commander of 2nd Fleet, who is also dual-hatted as the commander of the NATO Striking Fleet Land Forces. From this ship, we also exercise operational control of every underway United States surface ship in this AOR. There are 3 flagships like this one with each of the numbered fleet commanders around the world. A flagship basically sets the stage with command and control of fleet movements, evolutions, logistics. We run the show from here.
Sophisticated as are the new weapons available to military actions conducted at sea, they do not obscure the fact that true power rests with whoever and whatever controls space. The first phase of the space war lasted 12 years, from the launch of Sputnik until the Americans signaled their superiority by landing on the moon.
Okay, Neil, we can That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
This most important American victory, in response to the only challenger in sight, the USSR, was all but obliterated from the public mind by their failures in Vietnam. The next phase in the space war, 1969 to 1989, saw an ever-growing disparity between the two superpowers caused by the Americans' ability to outspend the Russians. It was reminiscent of the advantage the British had gained over the Dutch in a similar span of time in the 17th century.
It's less of a race now, not just because of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the joint sharing, but because of a realization that it's going to take much, much more investment and resources to get manned flight into distant space. In a way, our ambitions are much less now than they were 25 years ago.
Well, the whole transition from sea power to space power is interesting because space is the next great common, or is currently the great common of the early part of the 21st century. And like sea power, it requires really deep pockets if you're going to participate in that. You have to have the money, and you have to have the will, and you have to have the means to do that. You need the technical infrastructure to do that. Much as all of those things were required for sea power. If you're going to dominate the economies of early and late modern Europe, you needed money, and you needed the will to do it, and you needed the means to do it. You need the ships, the technology, all that kind of stuff. Space power in some ways parallels that. I mean, if you want to dominate space, you got to have cash, and you need to develop the technology. And not everyone can do it. Countries can stick a missile up in the air, it'll come down and you'll get some readings, but you're not going to have sustained presence in space unless you have the cash and the will to do it. The Russians seem to have recognized that during the Cold War, and at the height of the old Soviet Empire, they had the money, they had the will, and they had the means to do it. Much of that's completely evaporated now. The only country that seems to be able to do that at the moment, of course, is the United States.
9, 8, 7, 6, we have a go. Start, 4, 3, 2, 1. We have booster ignition and liftoff of the Space Shuttle Endeavour.
The Americans were able to demonstrate a superiority in space, which did not need to be proven in battle. It had been demonstrated not only quantitatively, but in the precision of their machines, their variety, and adaptability. What came to make the difference quantitatively between the US and all its competitors militarily was information and the means to gather and disseminate it. What the military has long called intelligence.
The information revolution had fundamentally changed the nature of naval war. The battlefield of the 21st century will be one in which the force with mastery of the information spectrum will prevail, making information superiority critical to our war-fighting success. Admiral J.L. Johnson, United States Navy.
The concept is called network-centric warfare, an information network that uses all the advances in communication and computing technology to connect widely dispersed and diverse forces into an effective team coordinated by leaders who have a completely clear view from space of what is going on.
Whenever I go to my command center in the basement of my Tampa headquarters, I can pull up a common operating picture. Every ship and aircraft, commercial, bad guy, good guy, in real time. With a 6-hour delay, which I could crunch to 2 hours if I wanted to, I can get a complete ground picture. That's the good news. The bad news is that the White House and the Pentagon will probably be interested in the same picture, and might be tempted to make decisions on their own, without input from the folks actually on the scene. That could be disastrous, as history amply demonstrates. General Tony Zinni.
In today's naval warfare, particularly what we call multi-threat warfare, where you have to deal with potential enemy aircraft, ships, submarines, you're really dealing with all three dimensions. And for one individual, the captain, who is only human, to keep track of that 24 hours a day is very difficult. So he has officers on board, the combat officer and probably an operations officer, who on a day-to-day basis keep track of the tactical picture for him.
In the last 50 years, we have taken a Navy which was basically a line-of-sight or very long-haul, high-frequency radio Navy, and we have taken it so we can do long-range, worldwide communications. Communications that are controlled by satellites, that may not be as affected by the weather, may not be as exploitable by the enemy, may not be as jammable to the enemy, and we are able to link our Navy together worldwide. For example, on Mount Whitney right now, we're exercising operational control of every ship that's underway in the Atlantic Fleet. Some of those are a long way away from where we're sitting right now in Norfolk.
When the system is up and running and it all works, it has annihilating potential. There's just no doubt about it. The current battle that's going on now is the information warfare battle. Armies are doing it, navies are doing it, air forces are doing it. It's information management. And it's all predicated now on, almost exclusively, on being able to use satellites. If there's ever a catastrophic problem in space and we can't use the satellites, then God knows what will happen to the systems that have been developed, because naval officers are being trained even less and less to use a sextant and figure out where they are. They don't just push a button and it gives them Latin long in about 6 digits. As long as that system works, and it does for the Americans right now, the power that it gives them is simply overwhelming. There's no question about that at all. It gives them real-time information so that you could manage a sea space or a battle space from anywhere in the world, sitting in an ops room. It's just incredible to contemplate.
In 1989, with the fall of communism and what was once the Soviet Union, American superpower lost its only challenger. Like Britain before her, the Americans have inherited not only power, but all the obligations that go with controlling something others have a right to use. Despite such constraints, they are unlikely to give it up.
I think that wherever the United States is in its relative position in the world, in 20, 30, 50 or more years' time, it's more likely to cling on to its sea power and its instruments of sea power than it is to foreign policy and land power instruments outside of its own hemisphere. The retention of significant power platforms on the sea and over the sea, I think, is going to be retained by the US and maintained regardless of administration. It's partly because it is a security issue. It's partly because navies have always been seen by both publics, but especially politicians, as something which you have more control over, because you can send your boats out and you can bring them back more easily than putting a US garrison in Macedonia or on the Somme and bringing it back. Navies have often been associated with isolationist foreign policies. You may be an isolationist and that causes you to argue for a big navy because it protects you from anybody coming to interfere with what you want to do in your own particular sphere of interest. So I believe the US will strive to maintain its position of strength at sea and above the sea and below the surface of the waters.
indication we have of how the great commons of space will evolve is what happened during the 400 years in which nations contended for control of the sea.
By the end of the Napoleonic Wars and through the 19th century, probably right down to the 1890s, Britain is the only world power. Their position is completely analogous to the American position now, and perhaps more so. I think their lead through the early part, from 1815 through to about 1860, is way ahead of anything the Americans enjoy at the moment.
In practice, the laws of space and the laws of the sea are open to discussion so long as what is proposed does not challenge the domination of the controlling superpower. That's what being a superpower means. And like the frontier towns in many a Western movie, there's room for only one.
The betting on sea power is that we're moving towards, under the American hegemony, more towards the sort of a continuation of the free trade concept. In many ways, we're moving back to the future. We're moving back to the 14th, 15th, 16th century.
Well over 90% of all of the goods traded today are still carried by ship. The dependence of oneself or one's enemies' economies on seaborne trade meant that control of the sea could give you a great advantage or could give your enemy a great advantage. And it could throttle you. It could force you to sue for a negotiated peace. Control of the sea gave one side or the other a military advantage. You could strike at the other's armed forces and could protect yourself from strikes. That element is there. The military element is surely there in command of space. But the ability to inflict vast economic damage in the way that a naval blockade could do is less there.
Pax Americana has begun, and with it the need by the U.S. to surmount every technological challenge in order to avoid a military one, and to monitor every conflict that could impinge on its power anywhere. The power wielded by great states has never been as massive as that of the United States at the beginning of the 21st century. The U.S. is not only the master of all it surveys, it has the ability, through space satellites and radio TV technology, to survey everything. But its power does not make it invulnerable. Comparable dominance at sea exercised by Spain induced countries to protect privateers in order to inflict damage on a state whose power they were afraid to confront. Today's equivalent is terrorism. The ambitions of the Japanese were dashed in 23 minutes at Midway, and over American power hangs the shadow that some unanticipated technological discovery might render all that exists obsolete, as armor and a new means of propulsion rendered the navies of sail obsolete in one day at Hampton Roads, Virginia, in 1862. The U.S. position now resembles and transcends that of Britain at the height of her power, but it also resembles that of Spain when its great armada set sail against an enemy too puny to cause concern. But for now, and for the foreseeable future, control of space ensures America continued control of the sea and the unmatched military and commercial advantages it bestows. Sir Walter Raleigh's statement remains as true as it was in the 16th century when he said, "Whosoever commands the sea commands trade. Whosoever commands the trade of the world commands the riches of the world, and consequently the world itself.